More from the 2014 meeting of the Organization of American Historians. We'll talk with two college professors about the history of Islam in America. This is Half an Hour.
Kambiz Ghaneabassiri from Reed College, thank you very much for being with us, and Denise Spellberg from the University of Texas at Austin. Your latest book on Thomas Jefferson, so much has been written about our founding father, his writings, his research, but your research really focuses on his interest in the Islam faith in this book titled The Purchase of the Qur'an. What did you learn?
Well, I was very interested in the fact that early Americans actually thought about Islam, and that Jefferson bought a Qur'an in 1765, 11 years before he wrote the Declaration of Independence. What's interesting is that throughout his life he would be engaged with diplomatic matters in the Islamic world, and he would be interested and purchase many books about the Middle East. The Qur'an is an early purchase, but what we see is that in his political life, although he didn't always get things about Islam right, he did advocate for the civil rights of Muslims. And he did this starting in 1776 and defended the idea until just before he died. So that was a surprising finding for me in doing this research on Jefferson.
And your book points out that he really had an interest in the Islam faith. Was that just because Thomas Jefferson had a curious mind, or was there something about Islam that intrigued him?
I think it's both. I mean, I think he was a bibliophile. He bought his Qur'an when he was a law student. He was 22 years old. And it seems that he had a very pronounced interest in Islam as a religion, as well as in the Qur'an as a book of law, which at the time would have been the way most Western Christians thought about the Qur'an. What's interesting about the Qur'an is, though, that it was the first and best English translation directly from Arabic. And it included a 200-page introduction on what the faith was, what key beliefs and rituals were. And so it would have given Jefferson a sort of introduction to the faith and history of Islam that was really the best available then.
Let's talk about the Qur'an as a document and deal with the fundamentals. What was it? Who wrote it? Why is this so important?
Well, the Muslims believe that the Quran was God's revelation to Muhammad that's alongside the continuity with the Bible, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, that it's the newest, the latest version of divine revelation that Prophet Muhammad received, and that it was collected over time by Muslims and written down, but it was primarily a recitation at first, and then written down over time, and that the Quran that we have today is the same as the revelation that Prophet Muhammad received, with some minor differences that account for differences in some rituals between Shias and Sunnis, and ways in which certain texts, certain parts of the Quran get recited, but for the most part it's believed to be the same revelation as Prophet Muhammad received in the 7th century.
What can we learn from it today? What did Jefferson learn from the Quran more than 200 years ago?
Well, I mean, I think that Jefferson was someone who was interested in the world and seems to demonstrate that he appreciated the connectedness of things, that Islam was part of our foreign policy, although he didn't know that there were Muslims in America while he was alive. And I think that he was interested in thinking about religious pluralism in a way that included Muslims at a very early stage. He wasn't alone either. We can see that although in his political debates he used negative stereotypes about Islam the way most of his contemporaries did, and that would have been the dominant form of response to Islam, he also demonstrates at key points that he understood the faith. So, for example, when a Muslim ambassador, the first to visit Washington, D.C., visited him as president in 1805, Jefferson moved the time of a state dinner from 3:30 to sunset because it was Ramadan. So he understood that the Muslim ambassador was fasting and wanted to accommodate him. We also see in his letters to North African rulers that at the end of them, particularly in a couple of letters to Tripoli, which was the object of our undeclared war, our first undeclared and foreign war, a Muslim power, that Jefferson signed his letters with a benediction hoping that God would keep this Muslim ruler safe in his keeping. So Jefferson's benediction and invocation of God in his letters seems to suggest he understands one of the essential points of the Qur'an, which is that Jews, Christians, and Muslims all worship the same God. And even if this was a diplomatic attempt to sort of connect with someone who was Muslim and powerful, in fact more powerful than the United States was at the time militarily, it still shows that he had a sensitivity and understanding of this doctrine of oneness, the oneness of God. And he probably shared it.
You want to follow up?
Yeah, if I could follow up on what Professor Spellberg said. That, one of the other things was that the Founding Fathers were trying to figure out a way of creating a community that was new ways of creating community around certain things. So Jefferson's interest in the nomocentrism, the centrality of law in Islam, was really key, because I think people have begun to do some work on the interest in Hebrew Bible and Moses as a figure who was able to, create community through loyalty to certain ideals. And I think there was also this interest that found this in his work, that to look at Islam, look at Prophet Muhammad as a figure who was able to create a community around certain beliefs and certain ideals, loyalty to certain concepts. And so I think the Founding Fathers were looking at these alternate modes of creating a state, creating a new national community that would be different from the models that existed in Europe.
And this really is the time period that you've been focusing a lot of your research. What have you learned?
Well, I've been looking at the history of Islam in America more broadly, and what I had learned was that despite the fact that most people began to think about the presence of Muslims in America after 9/11, and for scholars of Islam in America, they began to focus on the history of Islam in America since 1965, when the immigration laws changed and when Nation of Islam and groups like Malcolm X in the 50s and 60s gained national attention, that there's actually been a much longer presence of Muslims in the United States, dating back to the earliest period. As a matter of fact, the story of the Americas begins with encounters with Muslims, because European navigators were trying to find ways to bypass the trade routes that went through North Africa and the Middle East to be able to find alternate routes to South Asia and Southeast Asia. So from the very beginning, Muslims were involved in these imperial rivalries, and there's a very interesting story to unpack there that I have tried to begin to do, show the interactions that have actually shaped the Atlantic world, and show that Muslims, particularly in North Africa and West Africa, were very much involved, and the history of those regions were changed by the way in which Europeans settled the Americas, the slave trade that completely changed the economy of West Africa, and understandings of Islam in those regions too.
Based on that, then, when did we see the biggest influx of Muslims, what time period, and where did they come from?
We see the biggest influx of Muslims into the United States since the late 1960s, after the immigration laws were liberalized, because before the 1965 Immigration Act, we had quotas that had been established, a limited immigration from Asia, Southern Europe, and Africa. After those laws were changed, huge number of Muslims came to the United States in the hundreds of thousands. A lot of them came for a while and then left. Many stayed, and they come mainly from South Asia, from the Levant, what's today Jordan, Syria, Israel, the Palestinian territories, but they also come from North Africa, from South Asia, and from Yemen, from really all over the Muslim majority world, that ends up making America really a sort of microcosm of the Muslim majority world, because virtually any people from all over the Muslim majority world come to be represented in the United States by the time in the 1980s and 1990s.
Denise Spellberg, in your book, Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an, Islam and the Founders, you really move from the 1700s to today. So let me ask you about two moments that you write about in the book, more recent moments. In Washington, D.C., on Massachusetts Avenue, is the Islam Center, the Islamist Center of America, that President Dwight Eisenhower opened back in 1957. Explain the significance of that building in Washington, D.C., and what President Eisenhower said at the time.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because also Professor Ghaneabassiri talks about President Eisenhower in his book, A History of Islam in America. Eisenhower went to the opening of the Islamic Center, which was, I think, the first mosque in Washington, D.C., and he made a speech there about how it was an American ideal that this place be founded and supported and protected by the United States, by the U.S. government. And he actually said, we wouldn't be who we are unless we embraced you and he called it a church, but he meant the mosque. And, you know, considering the time, that was really an important precedent, it seems to me. And it allows us to think more broadly about which president might now visit a mosque, particularly at its dedication and opening. It's unlikely that a Republican would do it right now, and I think that's unfortunate. And I think that relates to fears about Islam that are largely unfounded. We have 2 to 8 million American Muslim citizens in this country now. So that I think it's important to remember that we also have a precedent in the 20th century for inclusion and for the representation of mosques as something as places of worship that are intrinsically American now.
And yet, based on that, and in your book on the American mosque, because of what happened on 9/11, are mosques today often viewed by some Americans as a source of terrorism? I mean, is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think...
rightly or wrongly?
I think that people wrongly assume that mosques are centers of nefarious Muslim activity or organization, but they're nothing more than actual places of worship for Muslims. And after 9/11, actually a little bit before 9/11, but particularly after 9/11, that actually come to play a very important role in the process of integrating Muslims into American society more generally. They have voter registration occurs in mosques. All sorts of social services are provided through mosques. Schools are being built next to mosques. We're finding one of the things we talked about on our panel on Islam in America at this conference was the fact that the number of mosques are growing and attendance at mosques are growing at a time where the majority of Americans are losing faith in institutions. The institution of the mosque is becoming more and more central for the way in which American Muslims interact with the larger society. And American Muslims have begun to open up these mosques once a year. They have a mosque open house event to be able to invite people in, and they're becoming sites of contact. And are playing a very important role in the integration of Muslims in America, despite what most people think. And one of the things that we spoke about yesterday again in the panel was they're coming to play a symbolic role in our discourses about the place of Muslims in America. And by looking at them as symbols of Muslims' presence in America, we're actually neglecting what Muslims do in them. And what they do in them is a lot more interesting than how they're being appropriated symbolically. What they do in them are things like schools and women's gatherings and Qur'an readings and voter registration and providing food pantries and things of that sort for the larger community, both the Muslim and non-Muslim communities.
In Congress, and you quote him in your book, Congressman Keith Ellison, a Democrat from Minnesota who is Muslim. What did you learn in talking with him? Does he feel prejudice or does he feel inclusion as a Muslim American who serves in the U.S. Congress?
Well, I mean, I think that Keith Ellison wrote about the response to his election and the fact that he did receive some death threats and a lot of very negative response. But it's important to recognize that when he decided to do his private swearing-in ceremony on Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an, which is now in the Library of Congress, that he had already affirmed his allegiance to the Constitution, which is the only thing that American politicians have to do. It says so in the Constitution, Article 6, Section 3. So the fact that he privately swore in a book that he believes in instead of a book he doesn't believe in, like the Bible, despite what critics said, seems to me to be the perfect endpoint of what Thomas Jefferson was actually forecasting as a positive, inclusive possibility. And Keith Ellison wrote about the politics of inclusion, not exclusion. And he really emphasized that he had come to represent all people in his district, not particularly Muslim Americans, although that they were part of his constituency. And the important thing here is that he was elected by a majority of non-Muslims. So the question of where religion falls in an overt or an implicit religious test seems to have been an important moment of sort of overcoming the assumption by Americans in his district in Minneapolis that Islam was a problem. It just happens to be his religion.
If Jefferson were here today, what would he think about the state of organized religion, the Muslim faith, and our democracy?
Well, historians are always loath, right, to channel the past. And Jefferson's mind was particularly complicated and full of very interesting complications, but also contradictions. I think he would have been absolutely thrilled that we have not one now, but two American Muslim congressmen, and that American Muslims are seeking to be more enfranchised in the political system. But I think what's interesting and tragic is that the fact that Keith Ellison and Andre Carson, both are congressmen who are Muslim, are African American, would have been somewhat perplexing for Jefferson, who never was able to get past slave owning himself, and who possibly owned Muslim slaves when they were transported against their will from West Africa. Since we have evidence, for example, that George Washington owned Muslim slaves because of their names. So on the one hand, he endorsed these universal rights for Muslims. On the other, he couldn't see them probably as other than white. So the category of race and religion intersect in a very interesting way with Jefferson.
We broke a barrier by electing and re-electing an African-American president to the White House. Would we be ready in this century to elect a Muslim in the White House?
This is a really interesting question I think a lot about, actually, and particularly in the context of rising anti-Muslim sentiments and thinking about the longer history of anti-Catholicism and anti-Jewish sentiments in the United States. And it's always baffled me. You were asking a question about what Jefferson would have thought about America today. I'm a historian and a religionist, so maybe I could be a little bit more courageous here. I would think that he would be thrilled, because what the election of people like Keith Ellison, the election of Obama, and the possible election of a Muslim, the election of a Catholic president and a Catholic vice president, would signify the strength of the American legal system, the structures that he built. And throughout American history, there's always been this sort of anxiety about how enduring the American political structures and American legal systems are. There's been a sort of anxiety about whether or not they could actually be transformative as new communities form and as new immigrants come. Would they be able to be transformed and find the same values in these systems as the Founding Fathers did? And I think over and over the move has been through greater inclusion, and people have found those values, but there's also this complete mistrust of whether or not these systems would be transformative to allow, for example, a Muslim president in the 21st century. And I would think that, if our history is any indication of the future, we're going to move towards greater inclusion as a sign of the strength of the political structures that they had set up. They've never been perfect. People have gone towards them kicking and screaming, but they have endured. Even today, when there are all these anti-Muslim, anti-mosque movements throughout the country, they've generally been settled in the court systems, because the playing ground there has been fair enough that people are able to make their cases and be heard fairly. When politics has gotten involved, things have gotten murkier, but when the institution, the infrastructure has remained in place and people have remained faithful to them, they've provided a means by which American Muslims could celebrate being American because of the freedoms that they have in this country and the ways in which they're able to exercise their religion, and allow the larger non-Muslim, the population, American population, to incorporate and include new people.
Based on what we're talking here today in Atlanta, I guess I would categorize this question as I didn't know that. So if you read the Qur'an, what would surprise those Americans who have never picked it up? What is your takeaway, if anything?
I think that there are key and important provisions that speak about Jews and Christians as people of the book who have a revealed faith according to Islamic tradition and whose faith is acceptable and protected under Islamic law. I think that precedent for early toleration is important. But just to cut back to this notion of a Muslim president, there was a Gallup poll in 2014 in March, and it suggested that 68% of Americans thought that it would be okay for a Muslim president. The numbers were much higher, even for Mormons. I think it was 80%, and for Catholics and Jews in the 90s. The problem is that 40% of people also said they wouldn't vote for someone if he was Muslim. But I think it's important to stress that the same kind of language that was anti-Semitic or anti-Catholic has been used against Muslims too, and that Americans have moved beyond it. So hopefully in a representative democracy, and with more understanding about the tenets of the faith, with the example of Jefferson who tried to learn about Islam from its core text, we might see greater inclusion and less anxiety about change.
Is it any different than other religious groups or ethnic groups that faced discrimination as they moved here from, say, the 1860s until the 1960s with the Islams?
So I would say yes. And the reason for that is that a large percentage of the American Muslim population is black, is African American. And some are African American, some are African immigrants that have come. And in the United States, we've generally had two means of integrating new communities. Communities have integrated through religion, and the First Amendment has always allowed them to integrate by celebrating American laws, by celebrating Constitution, by touting the fact that they're American. And we found this with the controversy around the Park 51 controversy, the so-called Ground Zero Mosque controversy. That was the first time, as a historian, I'm saying, we look back at this 10 years from now, that was the first time in the history of America that American Muslims were on center stage in their own voices, defining for the rest of Americans what it meant to be American, what the First Amendment ought to mean. And that has been one of the means, but we've also had this other means where the laws have actually suppressed people who are racial minorities. People from India Muslims from India could not gain citizenship before in the first part of the 20th century. Slave laws, Jim Crow laws, those were all things that were actually barriers to integration for people of color for much of the history of this country. And American Muslims are racially diverse and religiously different. And it feels to me that now it falls on them in the history of in American religious history and the history of America more generally to square this circle or circle this square, to be able to figure out a way by which we could have integration occur both through celebration of America and by holding Americans accountable, which is the way in which the civil rights legislation has always pushed for integration, by holding the political structures and laws accountable to their ideals. And we haven't figured out exactly how to do that, because if you start saying things like, well, these things seem unfair, then people begin to question your loyalties and wonder whether you're loyal enough. If you begin to celebrate America and say, I'm completely loyal, then people start questioning, well, what about these injustices? And right now it seems to me that American Muslims are in the unique position that other faith communities weren't, where they have to figure out how to articulate what it means to be American on both those terms.
Did you want to follow up?
I think that Professor Ghaneabassiri makes an excellent point. I also think that the question of American exceptionalism is really on the table right now. So that what Jefferson forecast and Washington and Madison about inclusion, about what we today would call religious pluralism, specifically of Muslims, this is our litmus test as a nation as to whether we're going to live up to our ideals or not. And I think this is a really valuable, instructive civic moment. But I do think that based on our history and ideas of exceptional inclusion, that Muslims will be more a part of what Americans think of as the United States, and that their citizenship will be defended in all the ways that matter to us as Americans.
Let me conclude with this point. As you meet with your fellow historians here in Atlanta at the Organization of American Historians, what kind of feedback are you getting? What kind of questions are they asking about you and your research? We'll begin here.
There's a tremendous amount of interest that's matched by ignorance about Islam more generally as a religion. The questions I'm getting are sort of people being curious, which I have to say, as a person who's been studying Islam for the past 20 years, is actually very, very welcoming for me, because to find that people are genuinely interested and asking critical questions and trying to find not easy answers, but actually answers that are backed by evidence, supported by scholarship, but finding more curiosity about where that these sources existed, that there were people who lived in this country as Muslims, that they could tell us something about the way in which America developed historically. One of the things, for example, the anti-slavery movement relied on the presence of African Muslims in this country heavily to be able to show that Africans were able to be educated, and because some of the African Muslims who were enslaved in America were scholars and could read and write, and some have left us tracts in Arabic. To be able to find that actually Islam had played a role in developing anti-slavery arguments and things of that sort. So it's been very refreshing.
You get the last word.
Well, thanks. I wanted to organize this panel because it seems to me that American historians need to think about America as part of an Islamic world now, and as a place where Muslims live and have historically been part of our civic discourse in important ways. And I think that the more integrated the subject is into organizations like the Organization of the better it is for all of us. And since the theme is crossing borders, it seems to me that this is a very important place to talk about Islam in America.
Professor Spellberg from the University of Texas at Austin.